Hello there, my name's Nicholas Pegg, and in the Big Finish production of The Box of Delights, I have the great pleasure of playing that slippery scoundrel, foxy-faced Charles. And it really is a great pleasure because, like so many people around the world, I have a very soft spot in my heart for John Masefield's wonderful novel. I was first introduced to it at the tender age of 8 by a wonderful school teacher we had called Miss Pennington. We read it in class with her. And then a few years later, when I was a teenager, along came the famous BBC television version, and I just fell in love with it all over again. And when I went off to university to read English literature, it actually played a part in my decision to write my MA thesis on children's fiction. So it's played a big part in my life, but I'm delighted to be joined by someone in whose life it has played a far bigger part, someone whose knowledge of The Box of Delights and its author are second to none. Dr. Philip Errington is the world's most eminent John Masefield scholar. He's the archivist of the John Masefield Society. He's written and lectured extensively about Masefield and his life and work. He's edited editions of Masefield's poetry and prose, including what is now the definitive edition of The Box of Delights itself, and I have my copy here. So, Phil, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
So, please tell us about your first introduction to John Masefield. Was it via a similar route?
Very similar, and probably at a very similar age. My mother had read it as part of a book group that she was part of, and said, "You really must read this." Now, at the time, I was into ornithology, and she said, "There are some fantastic descriptions of birds in here." So, of course, you don't tell a 7 or 8-year-old you've got to read a book. I resisted it. And then eventually I sat down and I was absolutely enthralled by it. Yeah, the descriptions of birds were great, but there was this magic, there was this sense of mystery. It was a gangster story and there was humour in it. So, yes, I just completely fell in love with it. And the problem was at this point that I wanted to read more Masefield. So looking around in the bookshop, there was nothing else. There was the first Kay Harker book, of course, The Midnight Folk, but very little else. Which led me to second-hand bookshops, and the rest rather played its part. So after using Masefield at various points, I mean, I used him as part of my GCSE, A-level, degree, MA and PhD, ended up in the second-hand book trade, or antiquarian book trade. So very important to me, John Masefield.
Yeah, wow. By the time he wrote The Box of Delights, John Masefield was, in his mid-50s, in 1935. But to look at the seeds of the novel, we really have to look right back to the beginning of his life, don't we? Because he did lead the most extraordinary childhood and youth. Can you fill us in a little bit on that, about, when he was born and what the first 10 or 20 years of his life were like? Because it's quite a story.
Absolutely.
Isn't it?
I mean, he was born in 1878, 1st of June, 1878. And it was a very happy childhood to begin with, and soon became rather tragic. His mother died, then his father died. The aunt who looked after them was particularly nasty. He was sent off to school on a ship in Liverpool, which was intended to toughen him up. He had said that he wanted to become a writer, and of course, reading and writing was exactly what you weren't supposed to do. It was an evil, sinful thing. So he was sent off to become a member of the Merchant Navy, really. And his experiences on board ship, I think those are absolutely crucial. He realised, I mean, he was delayed joining, so he was the new boy anyway, but then because he was ill for the first fortnight or so, he was late joining. And when he did come on board the ship, he was subjected to this world which he really didn't understand, how to sling a hammock or anything else, completely unknown. It was only at bedtime when he realised, when people said, "Do you know any ghost stories?" that Masefield discovered this joy of telling a narrative and having an enthralled audience. And it's really from that beginning that Masefield knew that he had this power, he had this ability. So yeah, his early upbringing was quite sad with being orphaned. I mean, he had many brothers and sisters, but this early part of his biography, and that comes into The Box of Delights. Kay Harker is in many ways John Masefield. It's a fascinating sort of use of his childhood in this fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, there are, as you say, there's obvious echoes, aren't there? I mean, Masefield was born in Herefordshire, and although the geography of the Box of Delights and its predecessor, the Midnight Folk, are a little bit jumbled and fictional, there is definitely a feeling of that sort of Herefordshire, Shropshire sort of area in the countryside, isn't there? But more... Sorry, no, go on.
Throughout Masefield's work, actually, there's this, one could call it Masefield's Tatshire. I mean, it's obviously Hardy's Wessex is more famous, but you'll find various locations coming up time and time again, not just in the Box of Lights. It wasn't a geography he created for the two Kay Harker books. It's there throughout his works. So if you read the long narrative poem Reynard the Fox, for example, they gallop through some of these fields. And if you read something like The Hawbucks, which is one of his adult novels, there's one of the characters even says that he's going to try and seduce the maid at Seeking's house. So these characters and this world of Masefield crop up time and time again.
Yeah. And Kay Harker himself is, of course, an orphan with guardians. Now, in the Box of Delights, his guardian is the lovely Caroline Louisa. But in the Midnight Folk, which you mentioned a little earlier, which is the predecessor to the Box of Delights, the other Kay Harker book, which was written, in the mid-20s, 27?
1927, it was the very, very late on. Yeah. Now, you mentioned two crucial things there. The first thing is Caroline Louisa, who is the good guardian. Masefield's mother was called Caroline Louisa Masefield. So there's a reason why she is named after this character. The other interesting thing for me, I think, is this repulsive aunt who looked after him. I mean, she was really an appalling person by all accounts. And Masefield really disliked her with a vengeance. It was only when she died that he brought out the Midnight Folk. But within a few years, I mean, it's one of these things that as soon as she had died, Masefield immortalised her as Sylvia Daisy Pouncer. So it's both the sort of the mother figure and the bad aunt are both very present in both the Kay Harker books.
Yeah. It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? Taking something so personal from his life and putting it front and centre in these children's books. But there's a kind of, although they are very lovely, very celebratory books, there is a sort of sadness at the very core of them, isn't there? He's quite a lonely boy, Kay, and he has these imaginary adventures, it seems to me, as part of it's part of the escape from the circumstances that he finds himself in, which aren't particularly happy ones.
That's right. And I think, the Kay Harker is the central character in the Midnight Folk, the predecessor. He is very much alone. He is surrounded by animals who talk and who he has adventures with. But the Box of Delights is slightly more grown up in this respect. He doesn't have talking animals with him, really. It's the Jones children which now enter the fray. Yes. But even then, I mean, Masefield has this device, of course, that they're all scrobbled or taken away at different times or aren't always there. There's never anybody to who he can then relate to. It's all Kay's adventures ultimately at the end. And so, yes, I absolutely agree. It's going back to that sense of Masefield feeling alone and Kay Harker being rather alone.
Yes. And yeah, as you say, I mean, the adults in particular get scrobbled and removed so that Kay, young though he is, has to be the proactive hero. He is
absolutely. It's the age-old thing, though. Of course, with lots of children's fiction, you've got to have your protagonist alone, usually orphaned. I mean, look at the pages of Roald Dahl, how quickly he bumps off the parents, etc. You've got to do it, and Masefield does it extremely well in the Box of Delights.
It's just the Box of Delights, written in 1935. It's a sort of a stepping stone, isn't it? It's a bridge between the Edwardian fantasies of maybe 20 or more years earlier, things like E. Nesbit and Peter Pan and maybe even The Wind in the Willows with the talking animals and so on. It comes sort of halfway between that lot and the Narnia books and Tom's Midnight Garden, and then on into Roald Dahl and Harry Potter and all the rest of it. And it's a sort of a really significant bridge, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think the crucial thing with these books is the introduction of this sort of magic realism, this fantasy aspect. Yes, you had got fantasy earlier on, but here it's brought right to the fore. And I think absolutely children's books benefit from this increase of fantasy. But people like Angela Carter, for example, great female novelist, said that the magic realism in some of her works, Nights at the Circus, etc., is as a result of what Masefield did in the Box of Delights. It's this crucial introduction of magic realism. Things happen and are not explained, really. It's I think in the Box of Delights, there's this crucial, the crucial episode is when the children are all on the toy boat and Kay says hold hands and they all shrink down to a miniature size, but nobody ever questions it afterwards. No one ever says to him, what was that all about? It's just taken as read. So you can pick holes like that in the plot, but when you accept that this sort of magic realism is what Masefield is doing, I think it works beautifully. And yes, it leads the way for the other books which were to come. I mean, it was published before The Hobbit, and then of course it does come long before C.S. Lewis. I'm particularly keen, of course, on the fact that I think this is the first flying car in literature, which is a great feat of Masefield's imagination.
Yeah. He was quite into cars, wasn't he? He was into all sorts of things, but he was a bit of a what we would now call a petrol head. Is that right?
Well, it's not exactly a petrol head, but I think the fact was he did have a car. There are all sorts of amusing anecdotes. In that he actually wrote a poem about an entire car journey, sort of from Scotland back to his house in Oxford. It's actually quite a good poem. But the car and flying goes all the way back to the First World War. So during the First World War, Masefield was sent to the States, mostly, I suppose, as a spy to assess the American reaction to the war. This is before they joined. And Masefield was in an American airbase, and he was asked whether he would like to go flying. And he decided that actually he would do so. And he describes this in terms of getting into a car and how bumpy it was and all the rest of it. So, there's a very, very obvious autobiographical aspect of the idea that a car might fly. It's actually, it goes all the way back to the First World War.
Wow. That's wonderful, isn't it? And so, going back to something you were saying a moment ago, the way in which he blurs the lines between what's real or, realistic and what's fantastical it is something quite new, isn't it? Because there's no actual sort of, it has its own logic, but it's on the face of it quite illogical. It's part of the charm, I think, of the Box of Delights is its almost sort of chaotic structure of the plot. You never know what's coming up next, and whether he's going to, shrink to the size of a mouse and start talking to a mouse, or whether he's going to go off and meet some ancient Greek soldiers, or Herne the Hunter. I mean, he throws everything in there, doesn't he?
And that's what one of the early reviews said. They wondered whether too much had been added in. I think there was one reviewer that said that there were one or two aspects of children's literature that had been left out, but apart from those, it was all there. And that's absolutely true. But that's, I think, the interesting thing is the comparison between the Box of Delights and the Midnight Folk. And the Midnight Folk was published without any chapter divisions. It's just an entire narrative. And at least with the Box of Delights, there are these episodes within the chapters, and that gives it some sort of some structure. But you're right. Overall, when viewed as a whole, it's pretty chaotic and fanciful. And I think that's part of its charm. It really is a flight of fancy in many ways.
Yeah. And we mentioned C.S. Lewis a moment ago. He was a big fan, wasn't he? I mean, it was definitely an influence on him when he came to write the Narnia books.
I think so. And, he mentions it in letters, etc. And, there are other authors, of course, Tolkien. Masefield knew Tolkien, knew him because Masefield was living just outside Oxford. And so with Tolkien, Masefield organised these Oxford recitations, they were called. So Masefield approached Tolkien and said, would you dress up as Chaucer and recite, I think, the Reeve's Tale? So if I've got this lovely mental image of J.R.R. Tolkien as starting out at Oxford, and the poet laureate saying, you must dress up as Chaucer, and what else could he do? But there's a lot of interactions and connections with Masefield absolutely there in the centre. He knew a vast number of people. And affected many people in many ways. And today, of course, it's only the Box of Delights and a couple of his poems which are really well known. And I think that's a shame. It does tend to take away from just how central Masefield was at the time.
Yeah. As you say, he's a very prolific writer. A couple of his poems have survived and are well known and go in all the anthologies, Sea Fever and Cargoes and so on. But you mentioned a moment ago, he was, of course, the Poet Laureate. He was a Poet Laureate for a very, very long time. And poetry was actually his first sort of foot in the door, wasn't it? That was where he first made his name as a poet.
That's right. So his first published book, which was in 1902, was called Saltwater Ballads, and it was a book of poetry. And he was known as a poet. His second book was called Ballads. Again, poetry. But he starts to, he wants to become a writer. He needs to earn a living. And so he started dabbling in other areas. Newspapers provided him an opportunity to sell short stories. Those got collected. But it's not until quite late, 1908, that his first novel is published. And he was known as a poet, but he was also a novelist, a best-selling novelist for adults as well. He was a playwright, he was a lecturer, he was a critic. There are a lot of things that Masefield did. But yes, that point is that he was appointed Poet Laureate in 1930. Now, this is at the time that a Poet Laureate would be appointed for life. It's changed now.
Yeah.
But he held that position for 37 years. It's quite interesting to see. He started off his career as Poet Laureate. The papers were full of it, saying that the caged canary wouldn't sing. And Masefield said, if I don't feel the urge to write a poem on this occasion, or this royal occasion, I won't do so. In fact, it turns out that he felt moved when Elizabeth II came to the throne and wrote all sorts of rubbish on all sorts of poems on Her Majesty's going to her peoples, etc. But a lot of it isn't very good and is of its time. But as far as laureateship verse is concerned, there's some fabulous stuff. And who'd have thought that somebody who was born in 1878 would commemorate the assassination of JFK in verse, for example? So Masefield heard about the assassination of JFK, looked at the news on the television, then wrote this wonderful, wonderful poem on the death of Kennedy.
It's rather incredible, isn't it? That, yeah, as you say, this extraordinary sort of times that he lived through, of course, both of the world wars, and he held on to the laureateship for such a long time. And at the time he was appointed Poet Laureate in 1930, it could have gone to A.E. Housman or Kipling or someone. I mean, it was a big, he was already...
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things, of course, he was appointed by Ramsay MacDonald, so the first Labour Prime Minister. And there's a feeling, I think, at the time that Masefield is one of the people. He writes, he didn't have a university education, and he's writing these texts which are extremely popular with the common reader. So he was a very, very popular choice. Houseman is a bit academic, Yeats probably a bit Irish. So Masefield was a very, very good fit, and was incredibly popular in that role.
Yeah. And of course we see the sensibility of a poet in his prose as well, in the Box of Delights and the Midnight Folk. But it's in his descriptions of nature, and the fact that he often brings in poems and songs and lyrics. The characters often sing songs along the way, but his poetic description, particularly I think of animals and the countryside, and it's the work of someone who clearly does have a poetic mind. I mean, he was quite meticulous, wasn't he, about when he was writing? He wrote quite quickly, but he redrafted and crossed things out and changed words very often.
Absolutely. I mean, he writes prose with the precision of a poet. There are a lot of changes. There are many, many drafts which the work goes through. So he does. I mean, the precision is there. The use of individual words. I think he's actually a beautiful writer of prose. Some of the poetry, it's got to be said, occasionally he adopts a very sort of rum-ti-tum line, and it doesn't always work for modern audiences, especially in sort of the long narrative poems, which is a slightly odd idea to us now, but certainly in his prose, it's some words, some placements of those words are absolutely specific and brilliant. Yes. The other aspect that I always find in Masefield is the humour. And
Yes.
there are some very dark moments. There's some very sad moments, but there's also this impish humour that you've got in the back all the way through. You're with Kay. You're enjoying the joke often. I think the best demonstration of this is the poem that you mentioned earlier on, Cargoes. You start off with a style of ship, you move on to another style of ship, and they're both grand styles, and then you finish off with the dirty British coaster. I mean, it's humour. It's poetic humour, and it's comic verse. You've got these great ships of mighty civilizations, and then you talk about coal from Newcastle. It's one of those sort of, it's a humorous poem. It's nothing more, nothing less.
And he's got a wonderful vocabulary that's all his own. I mean, some of it coming from slang of the day, but there are things in the Box of Delights that have survived and have become a sort of, cult favourite phrases thanks to the BBC adaptation. And I know in the Big Finish one, they've been retained quite rightly. I haven't got a tosser to my kick, and it's the purple pim and the scrobbling. What does that mean? I mean, we all know what it means, but where did that come from?
I mean, scrobbling is wonderful. It means kidnapping, but it's just a word that is introduced. It's never explained. You pick up its meaning, and it's gone on to have a life of its own. I believe that musical internet searches, if you can mirror what you've listened to and recommendations based on what you've listened to, that's known as scrobbling, I believe, in the trade. So, but Neil Gaiman uses it, and it comes back. Wonderful word, yeah. More use of scrobbling.
Absolutely. And is the purple pim, which is a thing that Peter Jones often says, that he that was a sort of family in joke, is that right?
You're absolutely right. So the pim is sort of the depth of despair, I think. And yeah, there's a letter which I found where it's written during the First World War, where his daughter is at school and describes that she's in the very sort of pim of despair, and that's what it means, and this is typical of Masefield. You'll just introduce an idea or a concept or a word. You don't need to explain it, and it works brilliantly.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's quite bold, isn't it, to just put it out there and it works. Everyone falls in love with those things. Those little quirks actually become like some of the favourite bits. So Masefield lived till 1967. The year of my birth. So that's amazing, actually. It does my head in a little bit to think that when I first read The Box of Delights, the book was only about 40 years old. But anyway, that's by the by. But he lived long enough for The Box of Delights to become part of the canon, and adaptations of it on the radio had already appeared, hadn't they? Which he would have heard and been involved in even.
Right. I mean, he certainly was involved with the first adaptation. They sent him versions of the script, and he objected. We must touch on the dream ending. So the original BBC radio adaptation wasn't going to have the dream ending, and Masefield was furious and rejected the script. Now, you're the poet laureate, you've got full rights over what happens to your work. You can do that. So, he threw a bit of a hissy fit over the fact that you were going to abandon the dream ending. But yeah, he was aware of the adaptations. He had control, I suppose, onto whether or not they would be, whether they were made in the first place. And he also worked on an adaptation that was to be made into a musical later on, and so he was aware that the book had this life of its own. Interestingly, of all his works, The Midnight Folk was his favourite, and I think what's interesting is that after his death, it really is The Box of Delights which now defines him. Now, there are reasons for that. Firstly, of course, it's, I think, a great book, but it's also the book which has been taken up and adapted and changed, and it's because of that. It's a familiarity. Now, you might ask, does a book have to be good before it's adapted? But there are many times that people said to Masefield at the height of his popularity, can we film this? Can we change this? Can we do an adaptation? And Masefield generally turned around and said no. And it's for that reason we don't have such a knowledge of Masefield's works. They asked him if they could film his novel The Bird of Dawning, and he made all sorts of stipulations about it. Could we film Sard Harker? And again, there were some rather awful requirements from Masefield that if you're going to film this ship, I need it to be the right type of ship. And of course, movie producers ran off screaming, but some really, really, really silly decisions from Masefield. Richard Burton was going to be involved in an adaptation of his first play, Good Friday. Now, if Richard Burton had been in a film version of Good Friday, do you not think we'd have that every Easter on the television and people would know it? People don't know it. It's completely sunk without a trace. And I think that's the thing about The Box of Delights. It was adapted. It was changed. People know it because of the other life which it had apart from the book.
Yes. I believe Masefield had a certain amount of unease about being memorialised at all, didn't he? He wrote a few things over the years in which he said, I don't want people to write biographies of me. I don't want people to, this sort of thing.
That's absolutely right. There's a sort of distrust, a dislike of biography, and he did say, he didn't want a biography written, and his own autobiographical works are very, very reticent over certain things. There was a he in one verse called Sweet Friends, he even puts a curse on anyone who should write his biography. I'm happy to say that the person who did do the biography, which came out in 1978, centenary of his birth, wasn't subject to the curse. And it's a very good, a very, very good biography. But it's of its time. There's certainly scope for a new look at Masefield, because there are all sorts of interesting aspects to his life which weren't uncovered and haven't really been touched upon.
Yeah. Well, we should bring this to a close fairly soon, but I just want to ask you about, and this is pure supposition, of course, but the very famous version of The Box of Delights, which of course came along some years after his death, the television BBC version from 1984. Do you think Masefield would have approved of that? Would he have been happy with that? Because that has become a sort of standard. There are people who watch it every Christmas time as part of their Christmas rituals and traditions. What do you think he would have made of it?
I think one of the big aspects about that production is that it keeps very, very closely to the book. And Masefield was always fearful that people would tamper with the narrative. And it is a very, very good adaptation. Add on to that the quality of the acting and the direction. It works beautifully. So it's that classic time of 1980s BBC TV drama for children that works beautifully. And I think the acting talent in there, that they're not frightened, but a well-respected Doctor Who centre stage, or indeed a great Shakespearean actor hamming it up for all he's worth as Abner Brown. And Robert Stephens almost goes over the top. It sort of starts chewing the scenery, but it is so beautifully done. And I think what's interesting with that is that Robert Stephens said that he wanted to do it because he remembered listening to the radio adaptation. So there are all these layers, and that people are familiar with the book and then become involved with it, etc. And that's the way it should be. So let's hope that the Big Finish production brings new fans for the book.
Yes, well, we can only hope. I hope that John Masefield would have approved. We're very fortunate to have some extraordinary names leading the cast. I mean, it's a great cast right through, but with the wonderful Louise Jameson as Sylvia Daisy Pantser, with Sir Derek Jacobi playing Cole Holdings, David Warner as Arnold of Toady, Mark Gatiss giving a wonderful Abner Brown. I really enjoyed doing my scenes with him. Well, I mean, I hope people like it. I'm sure they will. I think it's a terrific production. It's a beautiful adaptation. Barnaby Edwards has directed it beautifully. So let us hope that people enjoy it, and let us hope that John Masefield would have enjoyed it. Well, Phil, thank you so much for telling us so much that's fascinating about the life and work of John Masefield. I hope it'll spur people to go back and read The Box of Delights, because it's a wonderful book to read, and furthermore, to read the book that we've mentioned quite a few times, The Midnight Folk, which came before it, which is also a really beautiful book, and quite a different book from The Box of Delights, isn't it? But they complement each other really beautifully.
Absolutely. The two, you can't really read The Midnight Folk and not read The Box of Delights, and the people who love The Box of Delights should go back and read The Midnight Folk. They are very different books, but then they work together as a pair. So yes, and of course the person who's done the adaptation of The Box of Delights has previously done Midnight Folk for BBC Radio.
Yes, indeed. That's right. Well, there we go. So thank you so much, Dr. Philip Errington. Phil, thank you so much for joining us, for telling us a truly fascinating story. I hope everyone has enjoyed watching this, and I hope everyone enjoys listening to the big finished production of The Box of Delights. Thanks very much, Phil.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.